Good morning. Welcome to this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. My name is Sarisha Gunta. I'm Counsel and Education Director with PVPA. Today, we're going to be talking about whose job is it anyway. We're going to be talking about navigating the board-staff relationship at a nonprofit with Justine Cowan. Justine is an attorney here at Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta and a former executive director herself, and she has a great depth of knowledge on this topic. Thanks for joining us, Justine.
Nice to be here.
Now, before Justine jumps into the substance of today's topic, I want to take this opportunity to tell you, our audience, a little bit about PVPA. Our mission is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits. We do this by matching eligible nonprofit organizations with volunteer attorneys from the Atlanta area. These attorneys are from the leading corporations and law firms in Georgia and are able to assist nonprofits with their business law matters. Our clients are 501c3 organizations that are in or around Metro Atlanta, serve low-income and disadvantaged individuals, and are otherwise unable to afford legal services. We also have a wealth of information for all nonprofits in Georgia that are available for free on our website. These include past webcasts, podcasts, tons of articles, and also on our webcast, we list our upcoming events. In normal times, we are also able to offer in-person workshops monthly. And now a quick disclaimer. Please keep in mind that today's information is just general information. It is not specific legal counsel. If you have questions related to your organization's specific situation, please reach out to an attorney. And please keep in mind that today's presentation is copyright. And now, Justine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sarisha. Well, I'm really glad to be here to be talking about this subject. So as Sarisha mentioned, I was a nonprofit director for 13 years. In addition to that, I have served as legal counsel for nonprofits for many, many years. And I've also served on the board of directors of nonprofit organizations. So what I've seen it from all sides, and what I'm hoping to do today is to discuss it from all of those different perspectives that might be coming around the table, because everyone who's on the board of directors of a nonprofit and the staff really care about the mission and are trying to just achieve that mission. But sometimes friction can happen between the board and staff, and so hopefully we can come up with some ideas to have a smooth functioning nonprofit organization for you. Now, one question is, what are the legal implications of this? Because Pro Bono Partnership is, of course, a legal organization. We provide legal services, and I think that at the center of a nonprofit and their legal issues is the board-staff relationship. If you have an organization that has a lack of clarity about the essential responsibilities for your nonprofit between a board and a staff, that's one of the places that I see legal issues slipping through. Insufficient oversight, missed filings, and also when there's transitions, when an executive director leaves, if the roles aren't clear, or when board members leave. And then also that can create crises that can detract from the mission delivery. But when there's a strong board-staff relationship, comes with that some really great work on legal compliance. There's the accountability that you need for it, efficiency, the ability to focus on the mission and respond to crises, and smooth successions. And of course, the added bonus is that funders love it when your board and staff are working really smoothly together. So I wanted to go ahead and just set the stage, things that I've learned over the years and perceptions about the board-staff relationship. The number one thing I'd like to emphasize is that nobody owns a nonprofit. And I frequently hear from time to time someone will say, well, I'm the owner of the nonprofit. Or I hear this from board and executive directors, there's no one person in charge. And the reason that that's like that is because the IRS considers granting nonprofit status, which is tax exempt status, to an organization as a privilege. And they also want to make sure that the organization isn't set up to benefit any particular one person. And so because of that, the structure of a nonprofit is diffuse. You have a board and you have a staff, and that can create some problems that you don't have just one person in charge. But it's also a great benefit for the organization because that means that you have a real team that's working together for a mission. Excuse me. The other thing is that your pro bono partnership lawyer represents the organization. Again, we don't represent any specific individual. So who responsibility is it for any particular task in a nonprofit organization? So there's a rule of thumb, and that's that the board exercises oversight and the staff implements, but with a shared vision. So that's just the rule of thumb. And as soon as we go through the presentation today, you'll see that there's really some bright lines and a lot of blurry ones, and that's part of the challenge that we have in operating nonprofit organizations. And also, the relationship between a board and the staff changes as an organization changes. So, for example, there might be a working board when a nonprofit first starts, where it's all hands on deck, and then as the organization grows, those roles might change. So what we're going to talk about today are policies that can help clarify those relationships, and also talk a little bit about how transparency, communication, and partnership can help with the board-staff relationship. So let's talk first about what the duties are of board members. Then we'll talk about what the duties are of the executive director, and then how we put those all together. So the duties of the board member are duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And the duty of care is that each board member acts in good faith with the care an ordinarily prudent person is in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. Duty of loyalty is to act in good faith in the manner the director reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the organization, and the duty of obedience to act within the organization's purpose to further the mission of the organization. Now, these are general principles, and so I think what we need to do is get into more specifics. The board is the vision and oversight part of a nonprofit organization. They determine the mission and the purpose of the organization. They appoint and oversee and evaluate the executive. They oversee financial matters, protect assets, ensure legal and ethical integrity, ensure adequate financial resources, which is, for example, fundraising, monitor and strengthen programs. So, for example, strategic planning, and as I said, fundraise and promote the organization in the community. So where is the authority for board actions? And this is an important part of the board-staff relationship. There are a lot of blurry lines, as I mentioned, and having clarity is the #1 tool to ensure that you have a good board-staff relationship. So the source of authority for board actions is you should take a look at your articles of incorporation and bylaws, your board policies and procedures, financial policies and procedures, board resolutions, and other policies and procedures adopted by the board. So whenever there's any sort of question about what the board should or shouldn't be doing, this is the first place to look. And one important thing is that the board acts by consensus at votes at duly called meetings. And this is something that's very important in the board-staff relationship, that a single board member does not have the authority typically to act alone and make decisions. Instead, the board makes decisions by consensus, unless the board has specifically delegated that authority to a particular board member. So the executive director, where does the executive director get her authority for actions? The sources of the executive director's authority would be the bylaws, job description, employment manual and policies, the budget, and we'll talk a little bit in more detail about the budget, the strategic plan, policies adopted by the board, and duties delegated by a vote of the board of directors. And again, one single board of director cannot act alone, which also means that that director cannot assign a task to the executive director. The executive director generally has authority to make unilateral decisions consistent with the authority granted. So this is a very simple graph here. And when I first became an executive director, I had a wonderful board chair. And he sat me down on I think it was one of my first days of work, and he drew this chart for me on a piece of paper, and it was very simple. And he said, this is the most important thing that you need to know to be an executive director and work with the board. And that's that the board as a whole communicates to the executive director, and then the executive director communicates to the staff members. That means that you can't have the project director, as an example here, communicating straight to the board. The project director communicates to the executive director, who communicates to the board. So let's go into some examples of board and staff roles. The first one is the budget. So how is the budget created and approved and implemented in a nonprofit organization? The first step is that the executive director prepares a draft budget. Now, one thing that I always liked to do when I was an executive director was have open communications with the board. We have very clear lines of communication and decision making in a nonprofit organization about who might make the decision. However, if you just walk into your board meeting and you say, here's the draft budget, that's not necessarily going to help with board staff relations. It's more of a partnership. So what I like to do is, when preparing the draft budget, is I would give the treasurer a call, and then we would sit down and we would go through it together, and so that we were pretty much on the same page. And then we would propose it. Then I would propose it to the board. The treasurer was on board. If there was any issues that I thought might be of particular concern, I would make sure the board knew about it in advance, and then we would have the discussion, and the board would approve it. So the board finalizes and approves the budget. That budget is the mandate for the director to go back and implement. Now, the executive director does not have to spend all of the budget. So let's say the budget is $250,000. There's nothing in that budget that says the director has to spend $250,000. But the director can't spend over $250,000. Now, under that amount, the director has unilateral authority to implement that budget. So no additional permission is needed. And what that means is that the board should say, I really don't want you to buy that computer. If that is already in the budget, that decision has already been made. Now, what happens when there is an expenditure outside the budget that might happen? And this is, I have a little policy alerts as we go along, is what do you do if, for example, something unexpected comes up and the executive director really believes that there needs to be additional expenditures over the budget. For most circumstances, I like to have a policy in place that talks about overruns and when the director should go to the board about those overruns. And you can have them either per line item or overall. So for example, you might have a policy that says for 10% or 5% or whatever overruns, the director does not have to come back to the board for further approval, just needs to report it at the next meeting, whatever it may be. And the board would need to decide whether or not that's going to be per line item. So for example, if you have staff expenses for $100,000, is it going to be that you can have an overrun of the entire budget of $250,000, or would it just be that they have to go and ask for more permission if it's an overrun on a particular item? And there's no correct answer on that. You can make a decision on your own. The place that I sometimes had to go to the board to talk about an overrun was in the wonderful circumstances where you would ask for a grant for a particular project, and then you would get that grant in the middle of the year. Even though you just got a grant from a foundation that would allow you to spend money that you didn't otherwise know about, you still need to go to the board and ask for permission to spend those funds if it takes you over the pre-approved budget. And then the executive director is responsible for reporting on the expenses to the budget. Generally, no less than quarterly is the best practice. So let's talk about employment. This is another area where there's sometimes some confusion between the executive director and the board of directors. So the executive director hires, fires, and manages the staff. And the board of directors hires the executive director. And again, as a board, this is a board decision in which the board would decide collectively to hire the executive director. The executive director is responsible for the staff. That means that the executive director determines the salary through the approved budget. Now there can be some blurry lines about staff. For example, the board might adopt a policy that has a salary chart, for example, that gives some guidance about salaries to make sure that they're consistent and it's appropriate use of nonprofit resources and that type of thing. The most important thing to have here is to have a policy and a procedure, and as many clear lines as you can create between the executive director and the board of directors, the smoother the relationship is. So the executive director evaluates staff performance and addresses staff grievances. So that means, for example, if a member of the staff is upset about something that's happening at the organization, that staff member should be going to the executive director and not to the board of directors. And the board of directors should know that if a staff person comes to them with a grievance, that board of directors should say, I'm sorry, you need to take that up with your executive director. With that said, there should be in place at your organization a whistleblower policy or a grievance policy in the event that there's some sort of, for example, there's some counting irregularities, and there has to be some sort of procedure so that the staff can report problems with the nonprofit that fall in the realm of the board of directors' fiduciary and oversight duties to make sure that the organization is being run properly. That is a policy that Pro Bono Partnership can help put together for you. And so the executive director addresses staff grievances and creates and implements employment policies. Now, the employment policies sometimes might be approved by the board of directors, but the executive director would put those together. And so the board hires the executive director, determines the executive director's salary, and again, another policy alert, that could be through an executive compensation policy. And again, that is a policy that Pro Bono Partnership can help put together for your organization. The board as a whole evaluates the executive director's performance, decides to add staff, and oversees employment policies. But again, it's the macro level of dealing with employment, and the executive director deals with the day-to-day. Now, I will say, as with everything in the employment and in the board-staff relationship, I always like to have open communication with the board. So, for example, if I had a staff person that was leaving, or there was some sort of trouble, and I was moving towards perhaps letting this person go, I would communicate that to the board at a board meeting, and we'll talk about some tools to make sure that the board doesn't then overstep. But I did like to let the board know what was going on, even if it was within my own authority. So let's talk about taxes. So the executive director would prepare the 990, with an accountant or whatever it may be. And then again, I always like to send the 990 to the treasurer of the board first, just for an informal review. And then we would present it to the board, and the board does need to see the 990 before it's filed. And then the executive director would file the 990. Now, it's both the executive director and the board has the responsibility to ensure compliance with the tax code. And so this is one of the reasons that sometimes there can be blurry lines is because both, it's a partnership. The executive director and the board both have responsibility for ensuring compliance with the tax code. The executive director, if there are any issues regarding compliance with the tax code, should definitely report that to the board. The board should be asking questions to make sure that there's compliance with the tax code. I always like to include fundraising in there because that's always an important part of an executive director's job and the board's job to ensure adequate resources. And so this is one area where, again, you really have shared responsibilities. And it's all hands on deck in fundraising. The executive director is fundraising, and so is the board. But there's a policy alert here on adopting a gift policy, and that helps clarify roles. And one of the areas where there's sometimes confusion is what happens when an unusual gift comes in. Who makes the decision of whether or not to accept it? So let's say someone comes in and says, I'd like to give you this piece of land. And you would have a gift policy in place that would let you know who makes that decision. So, for example, your gift policy might say if you get a gift of land, it needs to be reviewed by a real estate attorney, and then the final decision is made by perhaps someone on the board or perhaps the executive director before that kind of gift is accepted, or a gift that might be from an organization or from some sort of entity that is contrary to your mission. How are those decisions made? And then the executive director is in charge of making sure that the gifts are properly recorded and acknowledged according to IRS regulations. One issue that happens frequently is that the board staff relationship is not a static relationship. It's really evolving over time. And so when an organization first starts, I like to call, they tend to be what we call a working board. That means that it's all hands on deck. You don't have staff or you don't have all of the resources, and everyone really just needs to pitch in and help. And then you move along, and let's say you hire your first executive director. And then over time, you get more resources. The executive director, you are able to hire staff, and through that process of growth, the functions of the board are necessarily going to change, and so are the functions of the executive director. And that's where I generally see issues arise and where friction can arise because you're growing and changing. So, for example, in one scenario, they hire the founder of the organization to be the first director. And in that case, sometimes the founder feels a little bit like the owner of the organization because they did so much work to put together this organization. And suddenly they have to readjust to now having a board provide the oversight for the work and not be on the board. And then sometimes the ED can not be previously associated with the organization, and that can cause some friction too. So my biggest tip here is that each time you are making a change or you're growing, and it might not be exactly obvious when this is happening, you should revisit your policies and get consultants to help with the various stages of organizational growth. I have found that it's very, very helpful to have someone outside of the organization helping you through these transition periods. So let's talk about some of the common problems that I have seen over the years. Of course, one that we've already talked about is the individual board member assigning a task to the executive director. Another one is that the board assigns tasks to employees. Well, let's step back to the individual board member assigning tasks to ED. Remember, the board can only act through consensus. So an individual board member can't assign a task to an executive director. I had that happen to me once where a board member called me up and was very excited, and he said, you really need to apply to this foundation for a grant. And I thanked him very much for the input. And then I went to go, of course, follow up on this lead and discovered that we didn't qualify for funds, so I didn't apply. And he was very upset that I had not followed through on the task that he felt that he had assigned to me. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit about the role of the chair of the board to clarify and help with those types of issues. Another issue is where the board assigns tasks to employees or the board weighs in on employee issues. This happens. Employees and the staff, the employees and the board frequently get to know each other through events, and board members will develop opinions on whether or not an employee should stay or go or how things should be done. And I frequently see board weighing in on what, on hiring decisions, firing decisions, disciplinary issues, and that type of thing, which they shouldn't. And then, of course, the board micromanaging projects. So I have a tip here. One thing I frequently come across nonprofits that say, oh, we really want someone on our board who does PR. Like we want someone with a PR firm on our board, or we want someone that has this sort of ability on our board. And that's great because we're nonprofits and we're always trying to reduce costs. However, if you have a board member taking on pro bono a function that is typically a staff function, you will need to have a conversation before that to make sure that you clarify the board staff roles. So, for example, if they're doing PR, well, who's making the decision on the final copy? Who's making the decision on all these types of things and how the PR function is going to work? Well, those are the executive director decisions, but suddenly you have a board member taking on a traditional staff function. Definitely take advantage of those types of opportunities, but just remember that those are the good times to make sure that you sit down and clarify the staff role and the board role in advance. Other common problems is the executive director, one is serves as a board member or serves as an ex officio board member. We see that a lot. It is not, it's provided that your bylaws and articles and documents allow that. It is not unlawful. However, it is not a best practice. The best practice is to have a board of directors that oversees the executive director and that you don't blur those lines in your corporate structure. Another common problem I see is the executive director resisting board authority. And as a former executive director, I understand why. The executive director is running the organization day to day, really knows all of the details of the organization, and the board comes in and might have quarterly meetings and then makes a decision, and it can be difficult to it can just be difficult because you have such ownership over what you're working on, but it can create some friction. And we're going to talk about some ways to reduce all of this. And then the other issue is that the executive director doesn't report issues as he or she should and keep the board informed. So we've talked a lot about some of the problems with the board staff relationship, but let's talk about the solutions. So the number one tool for working on the board staff relationship is the board chair and executive director relationship. And I told you a little bit about the board chair that I had for the first 10 years of being an executive director. And he was my ally in really creating a board that understood its roles and responsibilities. And he was, so the first thing is that we had a great relationship. We would spend a lot of time talking and strategizing, and he was the enforcer of the boundaries, and he resolved disputes. So for example, if we were in a board meeting and a board member said, Justine, you should really do this. And he would step up and say, well, that's great, but we would need a vote in order to have Justine do that. And he would be that clear. And it's very important that there is somebody in your organization, and I think it should probably be the board chair, not the executive director, who understands that it is their role to enforce those boundaries. And what that does is it educates the board and it creates a culture where everybody understands their roles and responsibilities. Another tool is to have well-planned meetings. I don't like to have what we call surprise meetings. If the board expects that certain issues will come up, let's say the budget, or there's some sort of problems that they have to make a decision about, if they're not surprised, then the relationship just tends to work better there. So that, for example, the executive director keeps the board informed if there's problem employees. And so I would always let them know. But then if I said, here's a problem employee, as soon as a board member starts saying, well, you should really do this, remember, there comes the board chair again to say, that's great. I'm sure Justine loves that input. But remember, it's her job to supervise the employee. And I can't stress enough how helpful it was to have that executive director be that explicit about the roles and responsibilities. And if the chair, if cannot articulate what the roles and responsibilities are, then maybe you need to go back to your policies and procedures and make sure that they're really clear. And of course, one of your top tools is your pro bono partnership attorney, because we can help put together policies and procedures that make it really clear. Consultants are also a great tool to help with this. I have found that sometimes having somebody else give the same input that perhaps you're having among yourselves can be really helpful. I always like to say that, for example, I'll give my husband advice, and then someone else gives him the advice, and he's like, oh, that sounds, yeah, then let's do that. So it's the same thing with nonprofits, that sometimes just having an outside person come in to give some training and to help with these issues helps. And then, of course, ongoing training is always helpful. Evaluations are also a helpful tool. Having the board evaluate itself and also having the executive director evaluations. The way that we did evaluations when I was a director was that I was actually asked to put together my own evaluation, and I would put together a short memo that said where I thought my strengths were, where I would want to improve over the next year. And then I had a section that said, how can the board help me achieve my job? And that was part of the evaluation process. And then the board would also do the same thing and evaluate themselves. And it just creates open communication. Board staff retreats are also a good place to work on board staff relationships. An annual calendar that helps clarify whose roles are, who is responsible for what and when it happens. And then, of course, just respect, transparency, friendship, and open communications. Sarisha, do we have a question?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. I'm popping in here to share some questions from our audience.
Sure.
Kind of related to what you were just talking about. To what extent should the executive director be involved in recruiting and approving new board members as opposed to existing board members doing that?
Well, again, it's a partnership, and I have found that the board is a volunteer entity, and the executive director is typically paid full time, and that just means that the executive director has more time to do a lot of the tasks. And so even if it's the board function to identify new board members, really having that partnership in identifying and onboarding board members is an important part of the process. And then we'll just get right. I was just about to talk about board of directors onboarding, and so I'll just go ahead and jump into that because it's a really great time to make sure that your board has the expectations really laid out before them on what their roles and responsibilities are going to be. The first thing was identifying board members. I mean, typically this is done just through a brainstorming. I would be in the board meeting and we would all be discussing, who would be some good candidates, and you probably have some sort of strategic plan on what you would like your board to look like in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And so we would have those discussions and identify various people. And then the first thing we did is I would go with a board member and me and out to lunch to really talk about to sit down with the potential board member and to see that the relationship is going to work. And then after that, they would get a board job description so that they were clear about their roles and responsibilities coming onto the board. But then at the end of the day, it's really the board of directors that makes the decision on who comes on the board. But the vetting process is usually done in partnership, which is really what most of the board staff relationship is that you're doing things in partnership, but then you have to respect the decision-making, the final decision-making parameters at the end. And I hope I answered that question. Feel free to put more notes in the comments if I didn't. Other key policies that we've already talked about are bylaws, the board policies and procedures, the financial policies and procedures, including budget overrun policy, employment policies, executive compensation, and whistleblower policies. Strategic plan, succession plan, and the gift policy.
And Justine, I'm going to pop in here again for real quick and go back a couple of slides because I think we have a question here related to some of these key policies. Do you have any suggestions about what should go to the executive committee versus the entire board? And should that be covered in board policies?
Sure. Well, usually that is, you set up the executive committee in your bylaws. And the way that, I mean, there's different ways to set up an executive committee, but the way that I like to do it is you just have, you typically have the chair and perhaps some officers and maybe one other person on the executive committee. It depends on the size of your board. And for me, the executive committee functions as something that can make decisions in between board meetings. And so, for example, if the executive director needs to make a decision quickly, they can go to the executive committee and make and have that decision ratified. And then, that decision made and approved, and then you would take it to the board at the next board meeting to have that decision ratified. One problem that I see sometimes is that the executive committee becomes a little bit of a mini board. The executive committee should really be used to make decisions between board meetings and when the full board cannot make a decision. And then sometimes at a board meeting, there might be a particular issue that needs to be addressed in specific detail, and you would send that issue to the executive committee to report back the next time. Sometimes when I see the executive committee taking on all of the major decisions, becoming a little bit of a mini board really disenfranchises the rest of the board. And so you really want all of the major decisions being made by the full board, if that answers the question.
And one question we got in pre-registration is how often should bylaws be updated? And can you also talk a little bit about the kind of various phases of the board that you mentioned earlier, the working board versus the fundraising board?
Well, whenever your organization is growing and developing, you should definitely be going back and looking at your bylaws. So for example, if you have a working board and you're just a nonprofit that's starting out, and then you hire your first executive director, well, that's a good time to go back and look at your bylaws to make sure that they're really reflecting where you want to go. Then when you expand to have staff, that would be another good time to go back and look at your bylaws. If your board just expanded so that you have more people and you're setting up committees, it's another good time to look at your bylaws. So anytime you're having any sort of change, you should be taking a look at your bylaws. It should be fairly obvious when you should be updating your bylaws when you're starting to function in a way that's not consistent with your bylaws, which means that you need to be looking at your bylaws and know what's in them and following them. So if you're not sure if you should update your bylaws, that means that perhaps you're not looking at them enough. So, because you're not matching what you're doing with your bylaws and something's not functioning quite right. And I think there was a second question in there.
And we also had one question about how often should the board meet?
Well, again, how often the board should meet depends on where you are in your development. So for example, let's say an organization has just started and you're really a working board. Sometimes I'll see there that the board meets monthly. And because the board is really engaged in some of the day-to-day activities of running an organization, and to keep the organization going, you need to meet monthly. As an organization grows, quarterly is really appropriate. But in between the quarterly meetings, you would typically have committees meeting to get some of the items done throughout the year. So when you've gotten to the place where you're at a board that has committees and staff, the typical best practice is quarterly meetings with committees meeting in between that time.
Thank you.
Are there other questions in there?
I think we'll let you get to the takeaways and then we'll go to the other questions.
Sure. So the takeaways are that a healthy board-staff relationship provides the roots that you need to have a strong organization. And the number one way to create that is structure. And that's something that Pro Bono Partnership can help you with. We can help you put together the policies and procedures to create the structure. The board-staff relationship is inherently blurry. And we could have lots of conversations about the pros and cons of how the board-staff relationship is set up in the nonprofit arena. But it is what it is, and if you're an executive director and you're feeling some frustration, you are not alone. It's very common. But what I have found is that structure and communication and realizing that you're on the same team really help, and always get help. A nonprofit, there are so many resources out there to help you navigate the board staff relationship and put together the policies that you need and getting the training that you need. And Sarisha, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do have a few other questions. One of them is, how can an executive director ask for a salary?
I'm assuming that perhaps is the executive director, if the person could provide a little bit more information, is the executive director does not have a salary and they want to come on as a staff member, or they're asking for a raise?
I don't have more details right now, but since I said ask for a salary, I'm assuming that they're currently working in a completely voluntary capacity.
Well, if the executive director is working as a volunteer capacity, I mean, the first thing is the board needs to decide whether or not it's time to hire an executive director, and that's a decision to be made based on current resources and the budget and strategic planning. If the issue is whether or not an executive director wants to ask for a raise, this would be there are different types of ways that you would do this. First of all, you would hopefully there would be some sort of salary structure in place in the organization so that there are raises each year. When I was an executive director, I would make the recommendations for raises for the staff. That would be part of the budget, and so the board would approve the budget, but I would be the one that would be implementing that, and then the board would make the decision on whether or not how to give me a raise. By having the staff have raises, I think that it was obvious that I was asking for a raise as well. And the board should understand that it is their responsibility to properly compensate the executive staff, and that would include um, giving raises. Now, when I have worked with organizations that had issues with the board not understanding the importance of compensating the executive director, is there's salary surveys out there that sometimes I would bring that can help inform the board of what executive directors should be paid. But then also just sitting down again with the chair of your board and having a conversation about the need to raise, and then having that person champion you with the rest of the board.
Thank you. And we also have a question that I'll let you speak to. Are there sample board and financial policies that are available?
So the Pro Bono Partnership has some wonderful templates for financial policies, articles of incorporation, and that's really, it's a great tool that we have to put together some really solid policies and procedures for your organization. What we do is we share those with our pro bono attorneys when you have a matter taken on with Pro Bono Partnership, and then they are customized for your organization. Just by providing the financial policies and procedures, that would be a little bit akin to, I guess, LegalZoom. And so, but we personalize them for your organization. And so please reach out if you want financial policies and procedures. Please reach out to your Pro Bono Partnership attorney. Let them know that that's a project that you would like to undertake, and we can get those done for you. If you're not a Pro Bono Partnership client, well, please put in a request for legal assistance, and we'll take a look.
Yeah, and we do have a great number of additional resources on our website related to board policies and financial policies. We also have one other question that came up in pre-registration that I wanted to address. How should an executive director raise challenging topics to the board to try to educate them on certain matters? And in this situation, the registrant mentioned issues such as racial justice and diversity.
Certainly. Well, again, I'm going to take you back to that board, that executive director chair relationship. If I had a topic that I wanted to bring up to the board, I would sit down with the chair of the board and say, and we would strategize how to introduce that to the rest of the board. With that said, bringing in consultants is frequently, or speakers is frequently a way to bring that in. I'm not sure exactly of the context, but you know, structuring meetings and how you structure your meetings is how you're educating your board and training your board. And so thinking through, you know, for example, when we did our board meetings, we always had, you know, 15 minutes for talking about topics that really impacted the organization, projects that we were working on, something that wasn't necessarily, you know, in the board purview. And perhaps that's something where if you have that regularly, someone can come in and talk about racial justice for 15 minutes and really start the conversation. So there's a lot of different tools, and you just need to strategize and on how to get that in front of your board. And like I said, bringing in outside people is always a good way to have difficult discussions.
And Justine, it looks like we have one person. Oh no, she's not typing the question anymore. So oh, it just came in. In your experience, what strategies have you used to build relationships among the board and the entire staff?
Sure. Well, one is board staff retreats. That's not always, I mean, that's a big task. And so it might happen only once a year, if that. But what I always like to do is bring staff members to the beginning of board meetings and have staff members talk about something that they were working on, and just have some more informal conversations like that. I had a staff member come to every single board meeting and spend the first 10 minutes talking about something that they were working on and letting the board just ask questions and that kind of thing. And then remember, I had the chair there to make sure that they didn't overstep when you were developing these kind of relationships. Another thing is asking board members to come to the office, going out to lunch. And it's really, it's really about, it's some of the same tools you use, just networking. If you're going out to lunch with a board member, have a staff member come along, or have the board member meet you at the office to go to lunch and then take them around, and maybe ask a staff member to talk to the board about something that they're working on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Justine. I think that's all the questions that we have today. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us. And to everyone who attended today, thanks for joining in, and we hope you found this information to be helpful. Have a great day.